Leventhal was named after a place in Russia, actually. The word in German, Valley of Love, that Leben is the German word for love, and Thal, I think, is a shortened version of the word for valley. But I'll tell you the real reason why Leventhal is named Leventhal. The people came from Russia. The old German immigrants came here to this area first. This is the first place they came in Kansas. Maybe Topeka, but for the people in this area, it was around Leventhal. So in those days, in the 1870s, there were terrible blizzards. And so at one blizzard, 2 guys from here got caught along the creek here north of town. And so after the blizzard, the people in Leventhal, which wasn't named yet, went out looking for these 2 guys. So they found them froze to death along the creek. And somebody in the group said, "Let's bring them in. They're froze to death. Let's bring them in." And somebody else in the group said, "No, just leave them thaw." Okay, so the only thing I can point out, and you probably all looked at this historical outline, is that before the parishes were started in this area, all of this area from the Rocky Mountains to the Missouri River was called the Apostolic, meaning apostles, related to the apostles of the church. Vicariate, that's like an episcopal word. Actually, every diocese has a person, a priest, who's called the vicar general. So it has to do with being in charge of an area. So this whole area was not a diocese. It was the Apostolic Vicariate of Indian Territory east of the Rockies. And the diocese, the whole state of Kansas, was made a diocese, the Diocese of Leavenworth, in 1877. So from 1850 until 27 years later, this was all the Apostolic Vicariate east of the Rockies. Come on in. There should be a historical outline somewhere. There you go. So since this is a talk, and I don't want to miss any details, I'm going to read it and then I'll kind of add things as I go along. And you're welcome to ask questions as I'm talking. Just raise your hand or throw a book at me, or we can field questions at the end. So, we don't have any letters that were written by Father Valentine. Sommereisen was his name. But we do have a few things that were written down about him. According to what we have, he could easily be considered a modern-day St. Paul. Much like St. Paul, Valentine was a driven Christian Catholic missionary, a founding pastor of many parishes, 8 in this area, and some up in South Dakota and Minnesota before he came here. A preacher of the charisma, which are the essentials of the gospel, especially about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So it's too bad we don't have a recording of his voice. It would be somewhere between French and German, actually, because those were his 2 native languages. So let me tell you about Father Valentine, the founding pastor of St. Joseph Parish here in Leventhal, and 7 other parishes in this area. Valentine Sommereisen was born May 28, 1829, at Ruffach in the bilingual area along the French-German border of the Alsace-Lorraine region of eastern France, where France borders Germany. He was studying for the Catholic priesthood in Paris when he met Father Augustin Reveau, was his name, a renowned French missionary priest among the Dakota Indians in North and South Dakota. Father Reveau was at one time the only Catholic priest in the whole state of Minnesota. I don't know how many priests are there now. I'm guessing maybe 500 in that state. He persuaded Valentine and 6 other seminarians to leave the great theological school in Paris and finish their studies on the American frontier. Thus it was that Bishop Joseph Cretan was his name, Minnesota's first Catholic bishop, personally completed Valentine's seminary education and formation and ordained him on March the 8th, 1856, at the age of 27. A week later, this is a week after he was ordained a priest, without any prior experience, Valentine became the first resident pastor of an immense area in southern Minnesota. Sounds kind of like what's happening today in the American church, where priests are in charge of more than 1 or 2 or 3. There's a priest up in the Grand Island Diocese that's in charge of 5 parishes there. History doesn't exactly repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Things are the same as they were 150 plus years ago. Though this assignment was as pastor of Mankato, 80 miles southwest of Minneapolis, Minnesota, he was also responsible for Shakopee, which is a native Sioux name, I'm sure, one of those Indian tribes up there, Chaska, Sleepy Eye, Redwood, and 32 other mission stations within a 50-mile radius. 37 parishes a week after he was ordained. Can you believe that? Valentine spent 14 very fruitful years at Mankato. By 1869, 13 years after being ordained, he had 37 parishes in 14 counties, must have been small counties, with about 5,000 people under his care, 250 of whom he had baptized during the previous year. He baptized 250 people in 1 year. Even our largest parish in the Dodge City Diocese, the Cathedral in Dodge, never probably has baptized that many people in 1 year. And I have never served 5,000 people in any of the parishes that I have been in my almost 50 years of being a Catholic priest. This guy was a phenomenon. He also had 200 children enrolled in the school that he started at Mankato, which incidentally was one of the state's first schools. He facilitated the construction of the first Catholic church in Mankato and was about to begin another construction project when his troubles began. Some parishioners thought that his plans were too ambitious, namely too costly. Maybe he didn't tell them the story that I tell people when I'm about to begin a project, the bad news, the good news, and the bad news. The bad news is we're going to start this multi-million-dollar project. The good news is we do have the money. The bad news is it's still in your pockets. While he was attempting to win these people over, business of an undisclosed nature called Father Valentine back to France. Arriving there in the middle of the Franco-Prussian War, he was detained for well over a year because he had not fulfilled his military obligations. So back in those years, any priest in France was also obligated to serve in the military. I'm glad it's not that way today. During this forced absence, he discovered a sure way to convince the reluctant members of his congregation to finish the church in Mankato. He borrowed 12,000 gold francs, and I still have not been able to figure out how much American money that is today. I'm guessing, from what I've tried to figure out off the internet, it's probably about $5,000. And signed a note due in 10 years with 10% interest. Sadly, when he returned, the bishop of that area where he was appointed a new pastor. So when he came back, he didn't have a job. All during this time, Valentine learned to speak English, 2 or 3 native Indian Canadian languages. He already knew French and German, probably Hebrew, Latin, and maybe Greek. That's 9 already. As well as becoming fluent in Sioux, and was everywhere received by the Sioux Indians with love and devotion. He learned their language, he could speak with them, and they with him. It was an amazing, he must have been very capable with all languages. And so in 1873, after another disappointing experience of trying to build a church in Yankton, South Dakota, which is northeast Nebraska, he rode his one-horse and buggy with a black cross in the buggy through 260 miles of Sioux territory. He rode his horse and buggy by himself through 260 miles of Sioux territory to be the chaplain for General George Custer and his 1,500 soldiers at Yellowstone. They were guarding all the workers on the railroad who were building the new path through Yellowstone. He was there for 3 years, and in 1876, George Custer went to Little Bighorn, and you all know the rest of the story. And Valentine came to this area. Fortunately for us and our ancestors, he came to Fort Hays, and soon after to Leventhal, and the other 7 places to begin to perish in each of them. I haven't come across any final reason why he came to Hays, although there is some speculation that he knew about the imminent battle at Little Bighorn because he spoke Sioux, and maybe somehow he knew this was going to happen before it happened. But perhaps the main reason for coming was because of the growing number of Volga German immigrants, since he spoke German fluently. Nevertheless, he wound up in Rush and Ellis counties, becoming the first resident priest of an immense area, 170 miles from Russell to Wallace, which had no priest residences and no church buildings. During his 19 months only in this area, he performed 119 baptisms, 19 weddings, and 13 funerals. According to tradition, Father Valentine celebrated Mass in the barracks of Fort Hays, the courthouse in Hays, the public school, private homes, and even the bar in Hays. Can you imagine a priest having Mass on Sunday morning in a bar, smelling like beer from the night before? By mid-1878, he had arranged that limestone churches be built here Catherine, Victoria, Pfeiffer, Munger, Shenshin, Liebenthal, and Rush Center. That eventual church in Rush Center is now in La Crosse as someone's home. It used to be, was called St. Augustine's. He had left the area before that building was done, and it only lasted maybe 15, 20 years, and the main reason was lack of money. So they, the parish at Rush Center, sold it, I think, to the First Congregational Church, and then it was later sold, and anyway, there's a family that lives in that church. And by then, by 1878, the Catholic population of Ellis County had become too much for him to handle. And so, the bishop arranged to have the Capuchins take over the spiritual and liturgical care of the area in May of 1878. He was only in this area for 19 months. He was reassigned as pastor of Cottonwood Falls near Emporia, and was also given care of other mission stations in Chase and Morris counties. After a year there, he must have been tired from everything he did. He retired. He then filed a timber claim from the railroad northeast of Hayes, 1 mile north of where I now live. If you take Commerce Road from the interstate north a mile is where he lived. I still have not been able to find exactly where his house was and other buildings. There's lots of trees there. There must have been a lot of underground water. Somehow he realized that because of the rest of the story here. He spent 19 years attending to his vineyard, orchards, and gardens. He was from France. Of course, you know how to grow vines, grapevines, and make wine. People of all creeds came to admire his early day experiment station. People say that he had the first experiment station. He taught many families how to make a living on land, which isn't what it is today, especially without trees and fields. I think the main reason they went to see him was to have a drink of wine. He died on January the 25th, 1897, at the age of 68, and is buried in the Catholic part of the Hayes Cemetery, just northwest of where the large crucifix is there. If you go there, you're going to find his grave. He's actually buried in a plot surrounded by a low cement wall in the Hoffmeyer plot. Michael Hoffmeyer was a blacksmith who was in the army, so I've not come across this reason. I'm guessing that he must have met him when he came to the fort, and Michael was Catholic, so they developed a friendship. So much so that Father Valentine is buried in the corner of that plot. In 2026, less than 2 years now, in honor of the 150th anniversary of his arrival in the Hayes area, I am planning on facilitating a pilgrimage from where his farm was to the cemetery. And with the help of the Eagle Scouts, I am also planning on having a plaque constructed in honor of him, like they did up in South Dakota, along Vineyard Road, the east-west road along the north side of Hayes, and it's actually named in honor of Father Valentine's vineyard. So in conclusion, I encourage you to visit the Ellis County Historical Society Museum. If you've not been there, it's worth your time. I'm not sure if they're done with the renovation. They've been renovating the building, but it's a great thing. It's a well-stocked museum. There, in this museum, among the guns, you can see Father Valentine's cane gun, a gun that doubled up as a somewhere along the way, he picked up a cane gun. Probably up in South Dakota, who knows? Somebody gave him this cane gun. And also you can see his pocket watch. I have asked the director of the museum if she would look for his chalice. If it's not in the museum, I'm guessing that it's somewhere in the Hayes area, unless it was buried with him. He was quite the Catholic priest, a pivotal player in the history of Rush and Ellis counties in the 1870s, the 1880s, and the 1890s. So, what do you think about this guy? Do you have any questions or thoughts?